Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and I'm also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, a body corporate management company in Queensland. I'm your host for today's webinar, and we welcome back Chris Irons. And today, Chris will provide a communication lesson so we can all be fluent in Strata speak. Why do the words we use in Strata matter? Chris will shed light on the do's and the don'ts of Strata language, ensuring you're equipped with the right words for every situation. Whether you're a lot owner seeking renovation approval or a committee member communicating an upcoming special levy, today's webinar emphasises the vital role of clear communication. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information in today's session, including any discussions arising from submitted questions and chat conversations, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in the session. We welcome Chris Irons from Strata Solve back today with an unparalleled perspective on Strata issues. Chris Irons is a thought leader for the Strata sector. For over 5 years, Chris was Queensland's Commissioner for Body Corporate and Community Management, and now as Director of Strata Solve, Chris is an independent Strata consultant helping clients untangle their Strata issues with tailored practical solutions. Chris brings to the table over 2 decades of public sector leadership and policy development. He's a nationally accredited mediator and a strong advocate for trying to resolve Strata disputes without the need for legal proceedings. Chris is a regular LookUpStrata contributor. He appears in most editions of our weekly newsletters, as you would know, and monthly Queensland magazines, and tirelessly provides practical responses to our audience's Strata questions. So welcome, Chris. It's lovely to have you here with us again today.
Oh, thank you, Nikki, for that. Thank you, everybody. And a sincere thank you at that. Nikki and I know that there are a lot of ways and a lot of places from which you can draw your Strata information and your Strata education. So the fact that you would choose us, we do really appreciate it, really grateful for that, and never take it for granted either. I'm really looking forward to this one. I look forward to every one of these that I deliver for LookUpStrata, but I'm looking forward to this one in particular because we're going to sort of, this isn't going to be me standing here talking about section blah, blah, or of blah, blah. Nothing like that at all. Today I'm talking about what a lot of people who know me well would say is my absolute #1 favourite topic in the world, words. Some people say that quite uncharitably at times. Others are a little more charitable. I am a word nerd. I fully admit that. And this, you'll see where the origins of today's presentation come from as we go along. Words mean absolutely everything in Strata, and I'll explain why. But importantly, I'll explain what I think are some of the ways in which you can actually really make that work for you in resolving situations. All right, let us get into it. And first of all, Nikki sort of alluded to my background there in the intro, and I just want to expand upon that a little bit, not too much, but a little bit, because I know that you can listen to a lot of people say a lot of things about Strata, but I want to sort of clarify why I think I'm qualified to have this discussion and talk about these things. So that's me as Commissioner, looking considerably thinner there, actually. It must have been the stress. And of course, that was taken by Journo, and Journo's the only way they can possibly illustrate Strata is a picture of a high-rise. So that was their decision, taken right around the corner from the Commissioner's office, actually. So as Nikki said in the intro, 5 years, I think that makes me either the longest or second longest serving Commissioner. That's yet to be determined. I saw and heard everything there is to see and hear in Strata in that job. I was out and about all the time. Some people would suggest I was out and about too much. I didn't think that at all. Hearing about everything that happens in Strata. What I also found in that role is unfortunately, the worst of people. Nobody came to my office when they were in a good mood, and nobody came when they were happy. They only ever came at a point of distress, confusion, or uncertainty. So over time, and since I've left that role and in private sector, I've come to understand that there should be, in my very strong view, a very different way of approaching Strata issues, Strata problems, and Strata disputes. Words, language, and how they're used are an absolutely essential part of that process. So that's one aspect on which I am speaking, and one basis on which I have some authority to speak. The second authority on which I speak is that I have some hands-on knowledge. So I am an owner of a lot in a community title scheme. In fact, I'm the chairperson of that particular body corporate, and I am a tenant, or the word used in Queensland, occupier, in a very different scheme as well. And here is my Strata approved greyhound, Ernest, who Nikki was fortunate enough to meet recently. And I can guarantee you that's what Ernest is doing at this very minute. I'm so envious. But anyway, Ernest had to go through an approval process with the body corporate. There were a couple of issues getting him approved, but all was okay. There's been a couple of other Strata issues, nothing major, some matters involving wheelie bins, which we're still working our way through at the moment. The point being, I've got practical knowledge of what happens in Strata. And probably the other point, which I haven't put up an illustration for, because mainly I didn't know how to illustrate it. I spent over 2 years in the public sector, and a lot of that time was working with drafting legislation. So my job was to instruct Parliamentary Council on drafting acts, drafting regulation, and drafting bills. And you might think to yourself, that process requires legal expertise, perhaps, but legislation is all about words, and it's all about the placement of words. It's all about phrasing. It's all about what one word means in relation to another. The best people I've ever worked with in legislation were not lawyers, they were teachers or academics, because they understood the meaning and value of words. Anyway, all of that combines to make me something of a Strata unicorn. I'm not a Strata lawyer. I don't have a legal degree. I'm not a Strata manager. I'm not an on-site manager. I just don't have the skill set or the patience for those things. But my background and expertise enables me to sit amongst all of that. And it's on that basis that I speak today about this particular topic, this particular issue. All right, here's a word that I suspect Strata managers who are watching this would hear multiple times a day. And I dare say perhaps on-site managers and others would hear a lot as well. I'd like everybody who's watching this live or watching it later or listening to this to actually now take a moment and say that word out loud. Breach. Maybe say it again too, just for yourself. Breach. And I want you to sort of really listen to how that sounds. If you've got people in the office there, people around, maybe say it to each other, and have a think about how that word sounds. It's a harsh word. There is nothing pleasant or warm or soft about that word. It's a harsh word. It's got those harsh consonant sounds. Br, ch. That's when it's used as a noun, of course. When it's used as a verb, it's actually worse, I think. So, for example, I'm going to breach you. You should be breached. No, well, that sounds intrusive. It sounds interventionist. And I'd go a step further and say it actually sounds a bit violent when you think about it. Breach, breach. I'm going to breach you. Think then about how the recipient of that language feels. You're going to be breached. I'm going to breach you. Immediately, I think the recipient of that is going to feel offside immediately and threatened potentially and confronted by that because of how that sounds and because of the connotations which go with that word. So I'm going to ask you to perhaps eliminate that. And the other reason I'm going to ask you to eliminate it, certainly from a Queensland perspective, is that breach is actually not the correct term. That word does not occur in Queensland's Act. It does occur in one of the reg modules, at least one of the reg modules, but it doesn't occur in the Act. That's the word that is used in relation to bylaws in Queensland. And again, I'd like you to take a moment to say that word out loud and say it amongst yourselves. Contravention. Contravention. Immediately, I think you can see the difference there. That word rolls off the tongue. It's got multiple syllables, but it's also got those sounds that, and there are technical terms for these sounds, that have a bit more length and a bit more duration to them. Contravention. It doesn't have as many or the same harsh consonant sounds as breach does. Moreover, I think contravention can't be used as a verb. So you can't say to someone, I'm going to contravention you. I don't think you can even say I'm going to contravene you. You can say I'm going to issue a contravention notice. But immediately that is a different scenario and a different connotation for you. Imagine being the recipient of I'm going to breach you or I'm going to issue a contravention notice. They're two very different things, and they're two very different feelings that come from that. And not only that, you are potentially using a much more correct term in your conversation. I think that particular discussion about those terms is a really good place to start this discussion about words and language and the importance of those in Strata. So then, why do words matter in Strata? And at this point, I want to give a shout out to my colleague and associate, Dirk. Dirk is based in Western Australia, actually, and does some fantastic work with graphic design. Dirk, if you want to ever utilize Dirk's services, can recommend. So why do words matter in Strata? Let's have a look. First up, words give us clarity. So much of Strata is confusing and difficult and complex and hard to understand. If words matter, because if we can get clarity and remove some ambiguity from a situation, it's a much better point for us to start a potentially challenging process or a challenging discussion. Next up, Strata is absolutely its own language. So when I was commissioner, we would sometimes engage translators to assist clients, and that's all good. And I remember one instance in particular, I don't quite remember the issue or indeed the language, but I remember the translator was engaged and the discussion was being had. And at a certain point, the translator could not translate a particular word. It turned out that the Strata word or phrase that was one of the issues literally had no meaning in this other language. And if you think about it, some of the words used in Strata are just crazy. Statutory easement, utility infrastructure, lot entitlement, vote outside committee, resolution without dissent. Those words without context are so difficult to wrap our heads around. So imagine then trying to do it when English is not your first language. So that's why words matter, because we get some clarity out of them. If we use the right words, then generally speaking, we're on the path to get the right outcomes. And so a really obvious example of that, we go back to the bylaw contravention example. If we're using the right words there, we're nominating the right person, we're nominating the right lot number, and we're talking about the right bylaw. We do all of that, we have a far greater chance of getting the outcome that we want and the right outcome that we want. Of course, though, the flip side applies. If we use the wrong words, the wrong outcomes will invariably be the result. If we look at that bylaw example again, if we don't cite the right bylaw and the right section of the bylaw, if we haven't got the name of the person right and we haven't got our words right, then chances are that process is going to fail. Importantly, words empower, and in Strata, empowerment is really important because, again, I come back to what I said before, it can be very difficult to feel like we know what we're talking about in Strata. Confidence and assurance goes a long way to getting us feeling like we can participate in a process, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a dispute, whether it's a discussion. If we've got our words right and we've got our language right, we can feel empowered. That then leads us to feeling more confident and more assured that we can look after ourselves. The same applies to committees. They can feel more confident and assured that they can make decisions. Same applies for Strata managers. They can feel more confident and more assured that what they're doing is the most value add and most professional in the circumstances. Another great graphic here from Dirk. So what constitutes good strata language then? Here are some examples of what I think good strata language is, or what it looks like. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but here's what I think good strata language might represent to us. First up, it's accurate. No brainer, that one. If you are talking about section 50 of the Act, but in actual fact you mean to say section 100, immediately you have gotten yourself on the wrong foot, and that calls your credibility into question thereafter. Take the time to be accurate. And I'm going to say this, and some of you might not like me saying it, but don't look for accuracy from Facebook groups that are devoted to Strata issues, unless it's LookUpStrata, of course, or Strata Solve. But don't look for expertise from social media. You are very unlikely to get accuracy from that source. Strata language should be meaningful, and there are a few ways that you can interpret that. But I guess what I mean there is understand what it is you're actually aiming for. In a strata dispute, for example, a lot of people start out by wanting to punish, or wanting to hold someone accountable, or wanting someone to apologize. And while all of those things are valid up to a point, they're not typically things that you can get through strata dispute resolution. So understand what your meaning is. What are you actually trying to convey and trying to do in a situation? Good strata language, I think, is used in the right way, in the right place, at the right time, and it is not overused. So, is the washing being hung on the neighbour's balcony bothering you? Yeah, sure. It doesn't look great and it's annoying. Okay. It might actually be a contravention of a bylaw. Okay, that's fine too. Is it the hill you're going to die on? I would think it probably shouldn't be. I would think you've probably got bigger issues to worry about that. But if you go ahead and lodge a 5-page complaint to the committee about that, are you using your strata language in the right way, at the right time, in the right place? Are you overshowing your hand? I would suggest yes, you probably are in that case. Good strata language always suits its audience, and that can mean a few different things. The kind of email that you might send to a lawyer is not going to be the same email you send to an owner or an occupier, for example. That's an obvious example of the way in which, but then there are more, I guess, nuanced examples of that. So if you're in a building, if you say the strata manager or on-site manager or a service provider to a building which is largely comprised of senior citizens, I think the way you communicate there is going to be different to a building which is largely comprised of owners who are first home buyers or who are young families, or a building where a number of owners have English as a second language. Your strata language should suit the audience that you are trying to reach every time. Good strata language also gets properly acknowledged in the process. So I think, again, for a strata manager who's been engaging with someone for a long time, or not even for a long time, but if you get a lot of different emails and then you get an email from an owner that actually is precise, succinct, to the point, and on topic and does what you need it to do, acknowledge it, properly acknowledge it. Thanks for that. That's good. That's really what I needed to know. And you will start to get that back in return if you give out that acknowledgement, in my view. Of course, if we are looking at good strata language, we must conversely look at bad strata language. I do like that graphic in particular. What do I think constitutes bad strata language then? Well, there's probably a lot of ways in which strata language could be bad, but here are a few indicators in my book. It's inaccurate to begin with, and that goes towards what I just said in the preceding slide. If your language, if you say body corporate and you mean committee, or if you say committee and you mean on-site manager, that's inaccurate. It is unhelpful. Bear in mind, not only do you call into question your credibility and your argument, you confuse the recipient of the message, and that detracts from what you are trying to say. Always strive for accuracy as much as you can. I don't think anybody expects everybody to be 100% accurate all the time. I'm not, even though I am a self-professed Strata expert and word nerd, I would never say that I'm 100% accurate. You can't be, but strive for being as accurate as you possibly can. I think bad Strata language lacks context. So again, a good example of that would be if a committee and with a Strata manager is looking at debt collection on levies in arrears and sends or arranges to have sent a pretty harsh email to an owner about something that's outstanding. Absolutely, the committee needs to pursue that debt. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but if that owner has just lost their spouse or has terminal cancer, is that the right thing to send just at that point in time, particularly if you know that that's the case? I think language in that case is bad because it lacks context to be able to fully appreciate the situation. To me, bad Strata language is pejorative, it's negative, it's provocative, it's vindictive. I don't think anything about Strata is designed to provoke, and yet so many people use Strata language that way to actually get a rise out of somebody else. Even if you've got a Strata dispute, it doesn't necessarily mean that your language and discourse has to be negative. As a result, it doesn't have to be. You can still frame things in a relatively constructive way, even if you have a dispute with another party. And it certainly shouldn't be pejorative. There is nothing in Strata that's about punishment per se. It's about correcting a situation or addressing something which hasn't been done. But I don't think it's about punishment. And therefore, language should not be that way either. Bad Strata language is delivered without proper authority. And by that, there's a few ways that we can look at that. If I am emailing the committee and I'm not the properly registered owner or representative of that lot owner, even though I think I'm doing the right thing by engaging, I've got to make sure I have the authority to say it. Equally, if I am demanding that a bylaw be enforced against someone and yet I know that I'm contravening that same bylaw or a different bylaw, I should be aware of that situation. That's not, in my view, an authoritative basis on which to deliver a message. And frankly, bad Strata language has way too many words. If you're going to submit 10 pages worth of explanatory notes or motions or rants to the committee, it's just going to get you nowhere. In my former office, for an example, if an adjudicator is presented with a 500-page submission or application from a party, they're not going to appreciate that either. And that has happened, by the way. I can guarantee you that if you draft something, if you draft 5 paragraphs to send to your Strata manager and you save that in drafts, when you come back to look at it, you should be aiming to make that 3 or 2 paragraphs, in my view. There is always a place for fewer words in Strata. And think about it this way. Every time you use an additional word or an additional sentence or an additional paragraph, you provide an opportunity for the person receiving it to ask a question about it or to find fault with it. Eliminate those opportunities by using fewer words. Bit more on bad Strata language. Here's a few examples of what I think are really unhelpful when it comes to Strata language. First one, but. I try very hard not to use the word but anywhere in life. Forget about Strata. I just try not to use it at all. The reason why is that when we use the word but, we're actually dismissing everything that's already been said. So, thanks for that, Nikki, but I didn't like what you just told me. So we've completely gotten rid of the thanks and the compliment, and all Nikki is left with is the phrase, I didn't like it. When you use but, you are tending to denigrate the person who is receiving that. Not always, and I get it's hard to get out of that. I think if you can find ways out of not using that word, you're in a much better position. Next, one of my favorites, etc. Whenever somebody uses etc., and particularly if they use etc. twice in a row, I always know, or I always tend to think that that person is not confident, is not sure of what they're saying, and is not on solid ground in their discussion or argument. Because think about it, you use etc. where you don't actually know what you're talking about. If you did know what you were talking about and you were being accurate and you were using clear language, you wouldn't use etc. You'd use the language that you needed to use and you'd say the words that you needed to say. Avoid using etc. at all times if you can, in my view. And then two words which are really closely linked. First up, basically. If you use basically to someone when you are paraphrasing what they have said to you, you're denigrating them again, because you're suggesting that what they said was basic, number one, but you're reducing what could very well be a considerable discussion and argument down to a few words. So basically what you're saying to me, Chris, no, I didn't basically say anything to you. I said this. Oh, but basically, no. Basically is frequently used by people to try and put words in your mouth. Avoid, avoid, avoid. And then very closely related, and one that really triggers me. I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm saying it. This really triggers me, essentially. So essentially, Chris, what you're saying is, oh, I really, really dislike that one. If I'm speaking to somebody and I've spent 5 to 10 minutes explaining what their options are, how they can solve a strata situation, and then they turn around and say to me, so essentially, Chris, what you're saying is I can't do anything. That's really harsh, that one. So what they are essentially, quote unquote, saying to you is, I've listened to what you said, but I haven't heard it, and I didn't think it was relevant, and I didn't think it had any credibility. I think you're wrong. Avoid the use of those words, in my very, very strong view. All right. I'm going to talk about a very specific type of strata language now, because I think it's quite relevant here. I'm going to talk about lobbying. So some of you may have heard me say this before. I've said this in a couple of webinars, but I think politics and strata are pretty much identical in many, many ways. And think about it this way for a second. In the federal parliament, we have members of parliament who represent an electorate and then are elected to parliament. And it's from that group that a cabinet is formed. And that cabinet has the day-to-day responsibilities to execute decisions. It's very similar to strata. You have owners in a strata scheme, and from that group, a number of them become the committee which are responsible for executing decisions. The other similarity is that if you don't have the numbers, you don't get what you want. So lobbying is an essential part of the life of a strata scheme, and you lobby for outcomes that you want. You also lobby for outcomes that you don't want. And it's, again, a words and language issue, because it's all about messages and narratives. So when you have a politician on the news, that 30-second grab that they give you has been endlessly workshopped by their team of spin doctors, media advisors, and hangers-on. They have reduced a big, complicated issue into 30 seconds with a quip or something memorable that people will hang on to. The same applies in strata. You might have a really complex matter to do with maintenance and engineering and expenses and contracts. All of that information is relevant, but you want the shortest possible succinct message to deliver to people if you want them to come on board with it. So you look for the best way to deliver that succinct message and tell a story, the narrative. I think you get far more flies with honey than you do with vinegar in strata. And so the messaging and the strata lobbying that I do for clients, and I do a fair bit of it these days, is always a positive one. I don't do negative lobbying because I just don't think it's useful. And I also think there's a real danger with using, when you're doing strata lobbying, using your language in a way to rebut or attack another party. So I get approached by clients a lot, and somebody has sent out a letter to all owners and they want to rebut it. They want to respond to it. And my reply is, I don't think you should. You give it oxygen, you give it air. That's precisely what the other party wants. Don't give them what they want. Focus on you. Focus on your message. Focus on your value. Focus on what you're doing. I put up this slide, as I say, because lobbying is a very, very specific part of how strata language and strata words are used. And I also put it up because I'm doing so much of it lately. I just thought it was something that we really needed to mention. Maybe we'll do something quite involved on that next year, Nikki, maybe something like that. All right, here's a good one. There is a lot of bad news in strata, a lot of bad news that needs to get delivered. How do we best deliver bad news? Let's give this a go. So I reckon bad news in strata begins with transparency. And transparency is reasons, rationale, thought processes, logic. You don't have to say every single thing that you did in reaching a decision which is going to be bad news for someone, but you need it to be transparent so that you can explain to people why it is you've arrived at this particular point and why the news is bad. Bad news should also be timely in strata. So if it takes 6 months for a decision to be reached, which is going to be bad news for an owner, for example, if you're a committee, what happens in that 6 months is two things. First of all, the potential for exacerbation is there. But the second thing that happens is in that time, the person goes, well, they haven't made a decision yet, so I'm still in with a chance. It's still possible it's going to go in my favour. If you can find a way to deliver bad news a lot sooner than that, the person's still not going to like it, but it is much better than waiting that period of time. I can almost guarantee that. Bad news in strata should be accompanied by reasons, and I'm going to explain reasons a little bit more in the next slide, but we'll go into that in a bit more detail. If you're going to deliver bad news and you're wondering about what words and language, try and put yourself in the shoes of the person receiving the bad news. So no one wants to be delivered bad news, and no one wants to know that their motion or their request has failed. No one wants that, and no one's going to be thrilled to hear it. But they are far more likely to accept it if you can find a way to put yourself in their shoes. So committees, strata managers, if you are about to deliver some bad news to an owner or group of owners, an example might be a new special levy that has to be struck to do something, put yourself in their shoes. How are they going to receive that? How are they going to feel about that? And then temper your language to suit that. So if I was receiving that message about 100% increase in my insurance premium, what would I want to know and how would I want that message received? And then use that to deliver your message. So here's an example. This is a really bad way to deliver bad news. Committee declines your request. Well, why is that bad? There's no reasons. There's no transparency. I also think it's a bit inaccurate. Committees don't decline things. And I'll explain what I mean in just a second by that. But you haven't put yourself in the shoes of the recipient of that message. If I get that message and that's all I get, I'm going to be ropeable about that. Well, hang on, why? And did they consider everything that I gave them in that situation? Have they taken into account everything? All that statement does is invite more questions, more contention, and more dispute. And you want to avoid that. You want to avoid, where possible, people coming back and questioning something if you can avoid it. So that's bad. Here's a better way to deliver bad news, in my opinion. And we'll sort of have a look at this one in a bit detail. The committee has decided to not approve your request to keep FIDO in your lot. The committee has considered its bylaws and the overall impact on the scheme. Scheme is a Queensland kind of word. In deciding this, and notes you have not provided details including vaccination and desexing certification. So why is that a good way of delivering bad news? First of all, it's accurate. The committee has decided. Committees make decisions. So the committee has decided to not approve. It's also been made personable. They've referred to FIDO. So there is an idea here that this has been tailored to suit an audience. So it's not the committee has decided to not approve your request to keep a dog. committee has decided a request to not keep FIDO. So that tells the recipient that you have understood the specific circumstances of their situation. You've personalised it. Then reasons have been given, and it's transparent. The committee has considered its bylaws, so that's factual, and the overall impact on the scheme in deciding this, so you are repeating that issue about decisions, and notes you have not provided details including vaccination and desexing certification. So it's become factual and a specific reason has been given. You haven't done this. So while the recipient is not going to be pleased about it, how could they be pleased? They will at least understand what's happened. And there is an opportunity there for them to rectify the situation as well. I appreciate that my example there adds more words, even though I said before, use fewer. But in this case, you are using, and I use that word, but then, I'm very sorry. In this case, you are using more words to try and avoid even more words later on. You are trying to be transparent, clear, and accurate in order to avoid more words, more dispute, and more contention further down the track. So then, your best strata language techniques. Here's a few tips. Number one, deliver it in person if you can. And the reason why is that once you commit words to paper in an email, it's there forever, pretty much, and you can't really take it back. But if you deliver it in person, it's much more personal. It's a little bit warmer, dare I say, and it's also the ability to read body language, and that's a big thing. You know, the ability to eyeball someone in a situation is a great thing to be able to do if you can. I'd stress you do that one if it's safe to do so. You do that one if you've got the time and resources to do it as well. Not everybody has. I totally get that. But if you can, give it a try, or maybe use it once or twice and see if it's different to doing the same thing via email. Number two, and I've made this point quite a few times in this presentation, less is always more in Strata. Absolutely. When I engage with clients, I draft an email, I save it in drafts, I come back to it later, and I try and pare it back as much as I possibly can. Again, remember, fewer words means fewer opportunities for somebody to challenge you and question why you have or haven't done something. Next one, let it sit for a bit. Let the communications sit. Save it in drafts. Keep it overnight for 24 hours or for 24 hours. Think about if you even need to send it at all. Or if you're going to respond verbally, let that sit with you for a little bit. Don't necessarily engage straight away. Yes, I appreciate that in that case, you might start to stew on things. I do think, though, by sitting on it, you will get a much better perspective on what it is you want to communicate and how. This one, get some quality control happening on your work and on your communications in Strata. Get a trusted advisor in to help you. I don't necessarily mean me, although that's fine. I do that work, and I don't necessarily mean a lawyer, or again, that's fine too if you want. But a family member, a friend, colleague, associate, even somebody who knows absolutely nothing about Strata. In fact, I would suggest to you that's probably a far better thing to do, because they can look at it with fresh eyes and go, you know what, I don't understand what you're talking about there, or the tone seems really harsh on this one. Or maybe, as has happened to me, so when I was commissioner, I used to have somebody checking my draft emails, and they would frequently say to me, Chris, you haven't gone hard enough on this one. So what you're wanting is somebody who you can rely upon and who you trust to quality control your communications before you actually issue them. And this one, if you have any doubts about what you're saying or what you're writing or what you're communicating, just don't say it. If you have composed something and you're reading it and you're not sure about it, whether it's accurate or whether it's the right thing to say, then chances are it's not the right thing to say, and you shouldn't be saying it. If you're thinking something, I'm not really sure if I should say this, don't say it. Usually that little voice inside your head, which tells you not to say it, is the voice you should be listening to in that situation. That is it for presentation proper. We have a bunch of questions, I think, Nikki. There's another gratuitous picture of Ernest as well for everybody. And me with a bit more of a beard too.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chris. Once again, wonderful presentation. I'm sure everyone got a lot out of that, which is great. I would imagine that in your day-to-day role, many of the disputes that you come across have come down to a lack of communication or poor communication or a breakdown in the communication to some degree.
I think so, Nikki. Yeah. Look, there are some issues in Strata that aren't about words, and they might be about a very, very specific technical matter, and fair enough, okay? But the vast majority of Strata issues and Strata disputes I've ever seen or dealt with have been about communication, either poor communication or no communication at all, or misunderstood communication, I suppose. That's definitely it, Nikki, definitely. Might go to this first question. I quite like this one. So whoever submitted this, if you are listening and watching, thank you. First question. Is or should the language be less formal when the group is smaller? That's a really good one. I think it's less about the number and more about the who. So who is it that you are communicating with? So if it's a small group of lawyers, I keep referring to lawyers here. I like Strata lawyers a lot. Don't get me wrong. But if you're communicating with a small group of lawyers, that might be different than a small group of lot owners. When you've got a smaller group, and I'm assuming this refers to an in-person interaction, I think you've got a lot more potential to adjust and use different methods, be a bit warmer, be a bit hands-on, be a bit personal. So I think if anything in a smaller group, you take that opportunity and you use it to your advantage. And then the second one, objective of language, legal protection versus getting your message across. Is there a difference, and when is one okay to use after the other? I think there is a difference here. Lawyers get trained for many years and develop a lot of expertise in what they write and how they write it. And that's why they charge the money that they charge, because they are writing a very specific document for a very specific purpose to achieve a very specific outcome. And I think that is different from everyday, day-to-day communications in a Strata scheme. There's a lot that we can learn from how lawyers communicate, both good and bad. And again, full respect to every lawyer listening and watching, not being critical. There's a lot to learn in that scenario. The next one, which I think has come from Victoria, love to hear your thoughts and how we can communicate to our committee in a way they may understand. I've had enormous issues with 2 members of that committee and starting to feel like I'm a failure at communicating, which is never a good thing to feel, of course. I've made it clear that all decisions and acts we take as a committee must be supported by the legislation. No one seems to have any knowledge of that legislation or our requirements to abide by it. For each action, I've had to explain that under the Act, we are instructed to abide by other acts as well. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard them use profanities. That's never good. To anything I've suggested, usually resulting in arguments. I'm no longer allowed to knock on anyone's door or speak with tenants about things like leaving items on common property. I've actually encountered this kind of situation before from time to time. There's a few different ways of approaching this, but the one way I'm going to provide for you here is think about it this way. Australians don't like authority. That's just the Australian way, and it's been the Australian way for centuries, I'd suggest. We don't like being told what to do. There's this long history of rebelling against perceived authority and perceived nanny state, for want of a better expression. So in Strata, I have seen it happen where when somebody starts talking about, well, this is the requirement under section blah, blah, and we must do this under section blah, blah, people start rolling their eyes and start glazing over at that point. And you can see that they're not liking it because they're being told what to do. So I would step back from that approach and look for a different way of conveying the same message. And I would, the most common way of conveying it, and the work that I do, convey it in terms of hip pocket. So if we do this, our property values will increase, and here's why. But if we don't do this, our property values will be negatively impacted. Here's why. That, I think, is a better discussion to have than quoting a section of legislation. Appreciate you're in a difficult situation by the sound of it, but just have a think about that approach moving forward. So this is a really good question. Language around vox, or votes outside committee. So this writer says the committee have made decisions that they declare as vox. Chairman sends a report to owners. The vox are usually administration items and do not require owners to be informed immediately. But there have been a few contentious items, and owners are not being given information about the actual motion and a few other things. So the question is, what VOC motions should be published for all owners prior to committee voting, and how can the committee handle simple administration items without having to constantly notify? I think this is very much about the transparency issue that's I mentioned before. VOCs are an absolutely valid way of doing business. Many committees use them. Well and good. Use them in the right way. Be precise in how they're used. And if you are getting a sense that people are suggesting they don't know what's going on, then that's a sign of distrust and perhaps you're not being as transparent as possible. Start getting transparent. Start being clear. Next one. This is a really good one. Common property implies property is common to all, and therefore residents can do what they want with it. I don't agree with that. I do understand what you mean. There is no opposite to common, the only being uncommon property, which makes no sense. I agree with you on that point. Could owner's property, OP, or owner's shared property, OSP, be adopted as the opposite of common property? I don't mind it, actually. I don't mind that one. I'd be interested in everybody else's views on that. What I would say is that typically the opposite of common property is a lot. That's typically what that means. But I get where you're coming from on that one. I don't mind the concept of owner's property. Be interested in everyone's thoughts on that. And then the last one we've got here on the pre-questions, Nikki, what information do strata units usually have on their notice board? I can only speak from a Queensland perspective. There's no kind of compulsion for specifics to be on a notice board. But I think if a body corporate's going to maintain and provide one, they should be putting things up there that are relevant to the widest possible group of people. Anything like that. I think that's usually the best place for it. If you've got to convey a very specific message in a short period of time, I'd probably avoid the notice board though. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And we've had a few questions, as you mentioned, come in chat. So there was a question, could you suggest some ways to encourage committees to respond to requests, instructions, decisions? Absolutely.
The best way, if you're asking this as an owner, which I assume that you are, you need to make sure that what you're putting up to the committee is clear. And it needs to be something they can make a decision on. So if you provide a lot of words and there is nothing in there that enables the committee to make a decision, you're just throwing a lot of statements without any questions, that's a mistake to begin with. You need to compel the committee to take an action they can take. And the committees, as I said before, make decisions. So you've got to give them a firm concept, a motion is what we call it, that they can decide upon. That way they cannot avoid doing that action.
Okay, we have one from Alex. Where to start as a young person? Should I be reading legislation? I'm completely lost as to how my owner's corporation functions and could be facing special levies soon. I'm in Victoria.
Don't start with legislation. No, that's not the place to start. At some point, do that for sure, because that helps you to be accurate. So you absolutely will do that at some point, but you do not start there. It's just wildly confusing and complicated, and you will probably give up very quickly. So you start with a place like LookUpStrata there, and remember, every strata issue has probably been canvassed and litigated before. There's hardly anything new under the sun in strata. So you look for where something has been dealt with before. You mightn't find something that is exactly like your situation, but you will find something close to it, I would argue. Look at what that means, have a read of it and have a think. Okay, I think I understand that. Now I have these questions about it. Then look for answers to those questions. Where necessary, take professional advice. There's no substitute for professional advice. Take advantage of government-provided services. I think in New South Wales, there is a limited service that you can have there to do that. But then at a certain point, if you've done all of that research, engage with your committee, engage with your other owners. I would be really emphasising engaging with other owners if you can. If for nothing else than to feel like you're not alone and that you're part of a community. That's where I would start, and then you go from that point.
Thanks, Chris. I would just add to Alex, I'm not sure if you're a subscriber to LookUpStrata, but because we send the weekly newsletters out and they give you those little snapshots of information as well, you can build knowledge up quite quickly with those weekly newsletters, which I think a lot of people that are new either to the industry or to strata living find really helpful.
As a committee member, am I allowed to let a box drop them with a contact email? I think what they mean, most committee members are residents. I think what they're talking about there, are we allowed to talk to other owners or reach out to other owners? I will speak only from a Queensland perspective on that, but in Queensland, if you are an owner, you are absolutely entitled to get a copy of the body corporate roll, and you are absolutely entitled to use it. You cannot guarantee how people will react to that, of course, but you are absolutely entitled to a copy of the roll that can enable you to reach out and speak to other owners. There's no privacy considerations in a body corporate for that sort of thing.
Okay, and then we also had a question for disputes. Is it better for the committee to communicate directly with residents or go through the strata manager?
Yeah, good question, that one. This one comes up a lot in the context of tenants, Nikki. And again, I'm speaking here from a largely Queensland perspective. This might apply elsewhere too, though. So in Queensland, if I am a tenant, and again, the correct term is occupier, if I'm an occupier and I contravene a bylaw, or I think somebody else is contravening a bylaw that's having an impact on me, I have a direct relationship with the strata committee. I don't go through my property manager, although they can be involved, and it's ideal if they are. I don't have to even go through my owner. The committee should be engaging directly with that occupier because occupiers have standing to do that. In that specific question, if your strata manager is engaged to do that sort of thing, I think that's what it always comes back to. What is it that your strata manager does? What are the expectations of that relationship between you and the strata manager? If that is part of that contracted and expected relationship, yes, you'd have the strata manager do it because they have expertise and skills to do it. But you don't just throw it on them if it's not contained in the contract or if it's not something you really haven't talked about a great deal.
Okay, Chris, well, thank you so much. As we come up to the end of the hour, we're running out of time again. Do you have anything that you'd like to leave us with at the end of this session finally?
Yeah, one really quick tip that I meant to probably mention in the presentation. So my former office, Commissioner's Office, has a 1-800 number that people ring up and they get information from. They used to have, and I assume they still do, a really great technique, which I think can apply to a lot of people. Rather than giving you all of the information you need right then, right there, they dole it out in parts. So somebody rings up and they've got all of these problems. The person will usually say, all right, well, your first step in this process, go away and do this. And they'll specify what that is and what you need to do. Go and do it. And if you've still got a problem later on, you come back to us. We'll talk you through your next step. So what that does, rather than spend half an hour and confuse the person where they'll get upset because they're getting all of this information, it's a portion. I think that portioned approach, doesn't matter who you are, individual, committee, strata manager, practitioner, I think it's a great way of doing things.
Wonderful. And a lot of people probably aren't aware that that service is available, and New South Wales Fair Trading also has a service, and I know over in WA, Leongate has a service that's similar to that as well, Chris. So it's really important that people utilise all of those avenues that they have out there to get information.
Great.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us again. Great comments coming through in the chat for you, Chris, saying wonderful presentation as always. Lots of beneficial information there. So we do thank Chris again for joining us. It's wonderful that we have this ability to tap into Chris's knowledge and his expertise. Chris's contact details are just on the screen there. So please reach out to him if you have any further questions or you'd like to have a chat with him about working with your committee or your office in some capacity. If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.